together like a horse and carriage. Let me tell you, brother, you can't have one without the other. Got some math. Seems like we know that one too. That is a lovely song by Frank Sinatra Sr. called Love and Marriage. Go figure, like it was paired today for some reason. But the thing is, it is a great song that talks about the necessity of love as a part of marriage. In fact, he says right there that you can't have one without the other. But unfortunately, our society doesn't seem to agree with this. Too often there are many teachings nowadays that say, well, you can be as individualistic as you want in your marriage because you should never have to give anything up. And there just grows this thing that you still become just as self-seeking in marriage as you would prior to it. And that leads to a lot of problems. We see a huge increasing number of divorces, not only in our nation, but across our world. In fact, I was recently at a workshop that talked about that lovely statistic that we all know that half the marriages end in divorce. And these two husband and wife therapists said actually it's grossly undershot. That number hasn't been reviewed in a while. In fact, it's a lot greater than 50%. And that's a scary figure indeed. So it seems only fitting that as the second part of our love sermon series, that we talk about love and its relationship to marriage. About those of us that got hitched, as it were. And here we are. And so with that, I think there's three main things that we can look at today as we look at these passages and reflect upon what love has to do with marriage. And that is to understand what love is in the first place. The second thing, to diffuse some of these misconceptions that come with the role of husband and wife in marriage. And lastly, the charge that we should support married couples, whether we are part of one ourselves or simply know people, because marriage is a lot of work, and we should support that, not only as Christians, but as people. And with that, let's take a look at some of these verses. They're quite meaty, let's put it that way. Our first one here this morning, as Mary Lou so fondly put it, this is the love chapter from 1 Corinthians 13 in its fullness. It is probably the most popular passage read at weddings. It just seems to be kind of a staple that way, because it talks about what love is. In fact, many of you probably, as you've heard it, could recite it in your head. Love is patient, love is kind, it is not envious or boastful. And it just starts to run through your head, because we hear about it a lot. And it's interesting because in its true and utmost context, it's not specifically about marriage, it's not specifically about marital love or romantic love, but Paul wants to teach the Corinthian church what love is and how essential it is to every facet of Christian life and of life in general. And we could spend probably the greater part of this morning and this afternoon going through every minute detail. I know Ed and the adult Sunday school do just that each morning. They get lost going through the Bible, and that's a good thing. But instead, I'd like to just focus on one particular piece of this. But to get us started, let's get a little context on this introduction Paul gives us. Because he starts off talking about the gift of tongues and of prophecy and all that, and a little bit later he talks about seeing something in a mirror. And these two sections have something to do with one another. And that love section is right in the middle. Well, he starts off by saying how essential love is to everything. Last week we talked about this equation about love and how each of the components were needed. Paul does a similar thing here when he talks about how essential love is, even to all the spiritual gifts that we can possess. He kicks it off, saying, if I could speak in the tongues of men or of angels, here he's talking about the gift of speaking in a language that we don't know by skill or by trade. So many of us know it as speaking in tongues. He says, if I could do that, but did not have love, I would be like a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. Now let's not bust Paul too much. He's not bashing people who like percussion. He's not doing that in the least. In fact, he's more talking about something that's dissonant or unwanted. Because in antiquity, they had gongs and they had cymbals and they were used in musical just them being played. He's talking about them being used to make racket. That if he had these gifts of speaking in tongues and was using it, but he was devoid of love, he would be like that. Something that was an unwanted noise, a racket. He continues on with the second illustration. He says, if I had the gift of prophecy and could fathom all mystery, all knowledge and wisdom, even if I had faith that could look at a mountain and say, move, and it did. If I didn't have love in my heart, it would mean nothing. And to close it all off, he goes to the self-sacrificing part of our faith. He says, if I gave away everything I owned to the poor and gave up my body to every persecution, my body companion, if I did that, but didn't have love for it all, everything would amount to nothing. He repeatedly says that in each instance, if he had the greatest of gifts that we seem to uplift in Christianity, if he had them, but didn't have love, it would make the gifts and the actions null and void. That's how essential he's trying to say that love is. And then he goes to explain what it is love is all about. And again, we could spend a whole lot of time. So much so that I think all of us will get hungry and walk out. And that's okay. But he goes in and talks about what love is. Love is patient. Love is kind. But it's this third description of love that I would offer up to you to think about. So it says love is not jealous. In this translation, love is not envious. What do we think about that? Love is not being envious or jealous. I'd like to push back against that one a little bit. And to do that, I'll take our attention to something we all know, the Ten Commandments. As we get down into, I believe it's the fourth commandment, God talks about having no idols before him. And God puts it this way, in that context. He says, I am a jealous God. Therefore, have no other gods before me. Hold on. God just said he's jealous of us. That he wants all of our love and attention. He doesn't want it diverted onto other gods where he gets 80% of your love and something else gets 20%. Kind of similar to what we talked about last week with talking about the first and greatest commandment Jesus gave to his disciples, saying, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength. That commandment echoes that God's jealous and wants everything. So how would that translate into our love of one another, with the love between husband and wife? Well, let's think about that. Because from one school of thought, people have been taught to not be jealous. That you shouldn't be jealous of your husband or your wife. And that can do certain things. But on the other hand, what happens if we are jealous and we want to spend more and more time? In a proper way, that jealousy can lead us to want to spend more time with our spouse. To find more ways to tell that person how much they mean to us, how much it's valuable, how much we want to spend time with them. But again, not to let it go too far and go awry, because as we all know, if you followed that emotion too far, you probably would never hold down a job because you'd be spending all your time with them. And unfortunately, all of us need to take showers, use the restroom, all that. So you can't be with your spouse all the time in church. So just to throw it out there. We all need some time to ourselves. And in a healthy marriage, we do have a fine balance of time together and time apart. So each of us can express that. So I would say that jealousy does play a part in our love for one another. I know even in my marriage with Kim, I look forward to spending time with her, but know that can drive me to want to do small little tokens of things. I grew up seeing my dad do similar things for my mom. When he would get up early in the morning to start his commute, he'd find some little way of leaving something to let her know that he cared about her. So that little bit of jealousy, as it were, that desire to spend more time, can motivate us to express our love a bit more continually and continuously. I think I've shared this with you once before during our time together, but one of my favorite quotes about love comes from Martin Luther, who started the Lutheran Church. And he was describing his own marriage. And mind you, this is a former Roman Catholic priest who then married a nun. Go figure. There we go. But when he left the Roman Catholic Church and was married into his wife, he wrote a description like this. He said, "Husbands should leave their home in sorrow and return in joy." So when they had to leave to go to work or to wherever, they should leave in sorrow, but when they return, come back in joy, because they were looking forward to spending their time with their wife. I think that's very motivating. And again, coming from an unlikely source of a former Catholic priest, I think it's a great inspiration to say where love can lead us, and how passages like Paul's 13th chapter can teach us something about love, how we can emulate this and make it a part of who we are. Now there's the second passage that a lot of us probably know. We've probably heard a lot talk about it. Maybe some things good, maybe some things bad. It's Ephesians 5:21 through 33. Though probably all of us saw it chopped up a bit, because this verse tends to be chopped up to suit the needs of the people wishing to interpret. A lot of people don't even include that first verse we read, verse 21, "Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ." Unfortunately, when you chop that verse, you lose the entire framework in which Paul is shaping the rest of this passage. He is saying that husbands and wives submit to each other, so a co-submission, out of reverence for Christ. That's how the relationship is built. And from that framework, he then talks about the specifics for the wife and for the husband. Unfortunately, one of the injustices that happens with this interpretation is some preachers and teachers will only focus on the wife. Go figure. What are they thinking? It's horrific. When all they quote to people is, "Wives, submit to your husband," and they put a period there, as if Paul did. As if Paul only spoke to wives and didn't talk to the husbands. If you look at that, there are 3 verses written to women, and the remaining 5, which are a lot lengthier, are written to husbands. So, you can see that I'm a little passionate about reading through that whole thing and saying, men were not off the hook. Not in the least. In fact, we got some interesting commandments there for ourselves. Well, let's take a look at that. So again, out of a framework of submitting to each other, Paul writes this: "Wives, submit to your husbands as you do to the Lord." Interesting thing. A lot of you know that I don't like to harp about languages and the ancient words and how they're translated, but this is a case in which we have to. The word there, submit, is better translated as respect. And you'll see right there at the end of this passage, as it concludes with verse 33, Paul says that. He writes, "However, each of you must also love your wife." They are referring to the husbands. "And the wife should respect her husband." That's the word that it actually is. It's not talking about submission, because this is where the interpretation goes awry. Because some people have used that verse, "Wives, submit to your husband," to literally make a system of domination in which they are asking for such submission and obedience that it becomes blinding and even harmful. It gets to a point where it locks out the women and allows them to no longer be a part of something in the relationship, but just to play a role, to not speak and to be meek and mild. And it's an awful thing when the text is being used that way, when it's warped, where it becomes destructive and not what it was originally intended to be. But again, let's go to what Paul's talking about. So he just finished with saying, "Wives, submit to your husbands." And he gives some context. He says, "For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, of which we are part of his body. Now as the church submits to Christ, wives, submit to your husbands." That's some contextual framework. Paul is writing to a system, a Roman and a Greco-Roman, I should clarify, a Greco-Roman culture in which their understanding of family systems is that the husband is the head of the household. It's not talking to our 21st century context in which we see husbands and wives as equals in the marriage. And he's pushing up against it. How? to that first verse. Again, he's saying you submit to each other. He's pushing back against that system, saying, no, it's not dominating where husbands get the final say. No, you submit to each other. He's undermining and undercutting their understanding. And now, husbands. This is where we get our little commandments. Picking up in verse 25, he goes, husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. I heard an interesting interpretation of that. When I was growing up, I remember sitting at my grandmother's house watching a televangelist speak about this, and he did a good job at that. Most of the time, you can get some interesting things listening to those televangelists. But this time it was interesting, and it was so long ago I forget who it was or what channel it was connected to, but I remember him playing with this verse a little bit and teasing it out so we could understand it. And he said, okay, husbands, think about this. If you really want to interpret this passage literally, understand what you're creating. It's saying your wife has to submit to you or respect you, but she doesn't have to love you. If you interpret it literally, how about that, husbands? How happy of a household would that be?
Amen.
Thank you, Dave. Exactly. The commandment only would specify, if you wanted to go literally, the only thing your wife has to do is respect you. She doesn't have to love you, but you have to love her. That's the commandment. That. So watch. You're on dangerous waters, husbands, when you try and force this literally. The other thing that preacher said, which continues to stick with me, was this. He said, Paul writes that wives should submit and husbands should love. But why isn't it both? Why doesn't he say both should do the same thing? And he offered up this. He said, well, you wouldn't have to command someone to do something if they already do it. Think about it. It would be like telling someone who has never told a lie, don't lie. And the person would look at you and say, okay. But it really doesn't help them because that's not their problem. That's not the area they're struggling with. So this pastor said, well, you see, the thing was that the husbands were the ones that had to be reminded, no, you are to love your wife. That is your role. Don't forget. In fact, it will make it something that we command you. And likewise, if you reverse the equation and said, Paul didn't need to tell the wives to love. Because of the two, love came very naturally. And love is what they do because they raise children. They are about caring for each other. And it wasn't an issue for them historically. It was for the men. And that's why Paul wrote it. But again, even going back to our interpretation of this, husbands, love your wives like Christ loved the church. That's a tall order, isn't it? Love your wife like Christ loves humanity. That's a self-sacrificing, all-encompassing, no days off out of the year love, husbands. That's what we're asked to do. That's what we're asked to reflect. And indeed, that's something worthy of spending a lifetime doing. Because if we do love our wives like Christ loves us, we'll continue to work it. Always and forever, as the vow goes. Speaking of which, there's that old phrase, isn't there? That marriage is work. I see some laughs. Okay, we got it. But marriage is work because it does take effort on both parties. Because, as we talked about last week, sometimes we get a little cranky. Imagine that. We get tired. We get frustrated. And sometimes our spouse just happens to be right there. And it's not because we're angry with them for any reason, but they happen to be there at the right time where we end up venting or they hear about all our gripes of the day. Because we can be happy and smiles, coming in, but when we step through that door, that's when we can let all of it out. And they say, what's bothering you? And you say, oh, I'm glad you asked. Oh, you don't even have to ask. There we go. And that's true, because sometimes we know them so well that we can see it in ways that nobody else would. We see a small, tiny little nonverbal cue that tells us something about our spouse. That's part of learning to love them and learning about them. Part of what we do. so marriage is work, and it takes time and effort, and we commit to it. And if we know that, that not only helps us if we're a part of a marriage to say, yes, it's going to be work, and I shouldn't fool myself into thinking it isn't. But if we aren't married, it means that's a clue to how to help people who are married. To realize if we're in a friendship with someone who's a wife, we can ask them. Maybe there's a particular issue we can sit down and help them work through. Or likewise, men who are friends with people who are married, we can too sit there and help them diffuse some of their stressors that would be better talked about with men. Because it's about helping one another. Because indeed, you need help to get through a healthy marriage. We were joking before the service. Ralph was joking around, if I ever need advice, his 50 years of experience might come in handy. He said he's learned the rules, and now he's very well trained. I guess 50 years would do that. Oh, I hear him mumbling over there. Okay. But indeed, sometimes going to those sources, the people who have experienced this for 10, 20, 30 years, that's a lot of lived experiences. That's a lot of sleepless nights supporting somebody. That's a lot of tragedies that you stood with somebody through. That could be a lot of children raised together, or grandchildren, or great-grandchildren. It could be any number of things. And to support one another means humbling ourselves, to go over and say, you know what? I'm new to the game. Can you please help me out, and so I don't make this greenhorn mistake, as many of us do when we're early into marriage. I'll fully admit to that. I still think I can win an argument. I haven't learned it. I'm learning. But indeed, the thing about today's passages that seems to keep me focused is that whether it's Paul talking about what love is and how we can better manage ourselves in love, or it's learning about the fact that part of love is submitting to each other because it's tied into our faith, friends. That's what Paul wanted us to know from Ephesians, that sometimes gets forgotten. That our love is tied to our relationship with Christ. We talked about that last week, didn't we? That if we love, if we know what love is, then we know God. And if we know God, then we know love. But it's all tied into how we express that to one another. Because just loving God isn't enough. And if we truly wish to love our spouse, we should also turn to God. Because He loves us. And if there's anybody that could teach us something about love, He's got a bit more than 50 years experience on the subject. He's been doing that since we started recording time. And God can teach us about this. He can give us the patience we need when the going gets tough. He can give us strength when we get weary. He can give us grace when we mess up. And He can forgive us when we need to be forgiven. So, friends, when it comes to love and marriage, you know the Bible has a lot to say about it. A lot more than just these passages that we've looked at this morning. So be students of it. Be students of looking for love in the Bible. Look forward to finding ways that we can better understand what's said about love. Because there's a lot of misinterpretations out there. Not all of them come from preachers and teachers that warp the text. Sometimes it's just our society giving us some false information about what marriage is, trying to sell us on something that doesn't link up with our faith or with God's Word. And still, the last thing to be mindful of, again, support one another. Whether you're in a marriage or not in one, because all of us need help. And all of us, as we grow to love each other, need some hints here and there. We need some encouragement. Because love is a tough and tall order.